After the death of King Edward here, who's Mary and Elizabeth's brother, in 1553, as we've already discussed, at a young age from consumption, you had the ill-fated Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, who reigned from the 10th to the 19th of July 1553. She was quickly overthrown, and Queen Mary, the First of England, also known as Bloody Mary, was put on the throne, and she reigned from July 1553 until her death in November 1558. Mary was no friend to Elizabeth, although they were half-sisters, because Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, had been overthrown by Elizabeth's mother, and so nastily done as well. Mary really did bear her sister a grudge. Another big thing, and probably more of a grudge for Mary than the family trouble, was that Mary was an ardent Catholic and Elizabeth was not. And under Elizabeth's brother, under his reign, she'd made a point of being seen as a most pious Protestant princess. So when Mary came to the throne, she had her bishops try and convert Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was one, and she did do this throughout her life. If she didn't want to do anything, she would become very ill all of a sudden and not be able to do anything. Anyway, Mary didn't put up with that, and after a while saw through it, and Elizabeth was imprisoned. On the 17th of March 1554, Elizabeth was imprisoned by her sister Queen Mary and transported by barge to the Tower of London. She docked at Traitor's Gate, the same gate through which Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, was brought to the Tower and to her eventual death. It was raining, but when Elizabeth arrived at the stone steps going into the Tower, she sat down upon the ground and wouldn't move, and said, "Better to sit here than in a worse place, for God knows where you will bring me." Elizabeth was captive in the Bell Tower for 2 months. Not a pleasant time. Her prison was located right above Tower Green, where Anne Boleyn, her mother, had been beheaded. This was done deliberately by her sister, as a way to bring her round to conversion, and to put the fear of God into her also. Who we're looking at here is Sir Henry Bedingfield, the man that Queen Mary appointed to be the jailer to her sister Elizabeth at the Tower of London and at Woodstock from 1554 and 1555. Elizabeth's health deteriorated rather rapidly at the Tower of London, and her jailer became rather concerned because he didn't want his royal charge to die in his care. So with letters and to-ing and fro-ing, she was taken from the Tower to Woodstock. After a failed marriage, 2 phantom pregnancies, the second of which was more than likely stomach cancer, Queen Mary, we see here, lay dying, absolutely worried and terrified, not of death, but what would become of the Catholic England that she'd tried to bring about. She knew, her Privy Council knew, and even her Catholic bishops knew that the only heir was Elizabeth. So, as Mary lay dying, she accepted that Elizabeth must succeed her. She died at St James's Palace in London at 6 on a grey morning of November the 17th, 1558. Parliament assembled at 8 o'clock in the morning, and the Commons joined the Lords to agree that the Lady Elizabeth must be proclaimed as Mary's successor immediately. The Lady Elizabeth's closest advisor, Sir William Cecil, who we see here, just fortunately and conveniently happened to have a copy of the correct wording on him, and the new Queen was duly proclaimed. One of her first actions was to make Cecil her principal minister, which he would be for the next 42 years. A lifelong relationship and friendship formed between these two, Elizabeth and Lord Burleigh here, as he would become, William Cecil. When Elizabeth was proclaimed Queen, she was at Hatfield House, and the fascinating legend and story is that she was sitting under a great tree there when the Lords came to her and proclaimed that she was no longer a prisoner, but now a queen, something for which throughout her life, a long life and a long reign, she regularly acknowledged and gave up prayers and thanks to God from raising her from the prison to the palace. This is Elizabeth being proclaimed. Here we're seeing Elizabeth being conveyed to her coronation with the greatest lords and gentlemen carrying her and by the chair, and her greatest chosen ladies behind. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth I as Queen of England and Ireland took place at Westminster Abbey, London, on the 15th of January 1559. And this is a later copy made in the early 1600s of the original image of Queen Elizabeth having been crowned. And what you see are the old crown jewels, which were destroyed and melted down in Cromwell's time. So you're looking at the Tudor crown imperial, which was created by Elizabeth's grandfather, Henry VII, when he became king. And you're looking at the old Auburn sceptre. The only original piece of the crown jewels that remains is the sacred chrism spoon of St Edward, which is the spoon which the monarch is anointed with the sacred oil. Back to Sir Henry Bedingfield, a man that she absolutely detested, her jailer. After Elizabeth's accession in 1558, Sir Henry Bedingfield, the man whom Mary I had appointed as Elizabeth's jailer at the Tower of London and at Woodstock from 1554 to 1555, hurried to present himself to the new queen and to ask her forgiveness and hopefully secure himself a place in the new government. Bedingfield had been particularly cruel and calculating keeper, and Elizabeth had come to believe that Bedingfield was under orders from her sister Mary to find a quiet way to murder her. Upon coming face to face with Bedingfield once again in 1558, this time the tables turned, and Elizabeth being in the position of power, the new queen dismissed the grovelling Bedingfield by saying, "If we have any prisoner whom we would have sharply and straitly kept, we will send him to you." The delivery is a prime example of Queen Elizabeth's wit and temper and sarcasm. Elizabeth's chosen faith was definitely that of the Protestant faith, and when she was proclaimed she did cause some offence, because the monks of Westminster, who approached her with lit tapers, basically to make their homage, and she looked at them and said, "Away with those tapers, we see well enough." Though at first she was friendly enough to the Catholics, and I think had there not been several Catholic plots against her, she may have been more lenient than she became. But after several plots, assassination attempts, her and her spymasters uncovered some pretty unpleasant plots, including the ones of Mary, Queen of Scots. She really did turn against the Catholics in a very big way, and that's why you ended up in England with so many priest holes in so many of these great Catholic houses where they were secretly Catholics, and they'd have a priest living with them, and when the priest finders come to search out the priests, they'd have to, if they could get there, hide in their priest holes. It became a dangerous time to be a Catholic in England under the reign of Elizabeth I. Here we see the Privy Council of England, an intimidating bunch of mostly older men, and you can imagine for a young lady in her early 20s, women, it's really horrible to say, but they were viewed as less significant and less powerful than men, as inferior beings to men. That's how they were viewed, and that's revolting to us. But can you imagine as a woman going in and for your first time and being faced with this lot, and this lot thought, great, a nice malleable young lady to deal with, this should be fairly easy. Were they wrong? Basically, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh here as he would become, once he'd got the gist of Queen Elizabeth, and they got on well, speaking with some other ministers, they thought that she might be malleable, and upon discovering that they weren't, he looked at them and said no. He went, "This young lady will rule as absolutely as her father did." Their first objective, as a young unmarried female with no heir. Don't forget, Elizabeth was and would be the last Tudor. Their first objective was to get her married and get an heir out of her so the line would continue. Elizabeth had looked at the reign of her sister Queen Mary. Her marriage to King Philip of Spain had been one of convenience. There was a great age between them, and when King Philip of Spain arrived in England, was actually quite horrified to discover that he'd been married to an old lady. Their marriage was consummated and she thought she was pregnant. It was a phantom pregnancy. Philip went away, which broke her heart. She did everything to try and get him to come back. She became a bit of a laughing stock, particularly with the phantom pregnancies, the burnings and everything. She had so many people burned, and with bloody Bishop Bonner, who was one of her favourites, a very cruel, wicked man, she became very unpopular and became a bit quite a butt of jokes and things like that. And Elizabeth, having seen all that, didn't want that. She knew that the moment she married, whether she was queen or not, her husband would become more powerful than she, and she was well renowned throughout her life, as you've heard in part 1 of our documentary. Even to her most favoured, who's Robert Dudley, when he would try his hand at nabbing a little smidge of power, she would dress him down and say, "We will have but one mistress and no master." But they tried always, everything, the Privy Council here, and William Cecil, to get her to marry. Blackmail, corruption, guilt-tripping, fear-mongering. They did everything. They were desperate for her to marry. And she was most famous to claim, "I will live and die a virgin, for I have a husband." And then she would hold up the hand that bore her coronation ring and say that my husband is this kingdom and the people of this realm. To which they didn't have the greatest answer, which must have been very annoying for a bunch of old men that thought they'd be dealing with a malleable young lady, which they found that she most certainly was not. As they discovered at the Queen's first opening of Parliament, when their first request to the Queen was that she would marry. The blackmail came in because in those days a monarch wasn't just a figurehead, they ruled as well as reigned, but they could only rule with the subsidy or grant granted to them by the Parliament, and if they weren't doing as the Parliament said, the Parliament could withhold or cut down their subsidy, which was a little to-ing and froing Elizabeth had several times in her reign with the Parliament, but she generally always won. She could be really manipulative. She was a really powerful woman who did have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. But when she needed to, she could play the little mousewife, shall we say, with tears and grief that would make the men do as she wanted. It'd make them feel guilty and terrible and whatnot and that. And she could also play a good hand at being ill. Some of her illnesses were genuine, but she was a bit neuralgic, was Queen Elizabeth I, and if things didn't go her way, she could fly into a rage. Later on in her reign, as we'll find out in another part of the documentary with the Great Armada, when it first happened, she flew into a slight panic and went everywhere with a sword. And one statesman commented, "Lo, now look, the Queen is ready to be piss herself for the fear of the Spaniards." Afterwards, and after he'd seen what she'd done, he was later forced to change his mind and said, "The Queen hath an invincible mind that showeth from whence she came," which means that she was every inch a king as her father. And that is how Queen Elizabeth I came to the throne of England, a tumultuous start in life. Luxurious in some ways, but absolutely dreadfully terrifying in others. She was a prisoner, a luxuriously kept prisoner at times, but a prisoner under the reign of Mary, and knowing that Mary wanted you dead because you'd pissed her off. Your parents' marriage had destroyed her mother's life, which she never forgot or forgave. So yeah, that's the tumultuous start to Queen Elizabeth I's reign and how she got there. So join me for the next part of the documentary. Throughout her life and reign, particularly her reign, she had several great turmoils. The first of which was on the 10th of October 1562. 29-year-old Queen Elizabeth I is taken ill at Hampton Court Palace with what was thought to be a bad cold at first. However, the cold developed into a violent fever, and it became clear that the young queen actually had smallpox. An absolutely terrifying disease at the time, which could and did kill. Just 7 days later, it was feared that the Queen would die. Fortunately, Elizabeth survived the disaster and wasn't too badly disfigured, although her friend Lady Mary Sidney, who nursed Elizabeth through the entire illness, was caught it herself, and she ended up being terribly disfigured for the rest of her life. What we're seeing here is a representation of what Elizabeth and poor Lady Mary Sidney and anyone that suffered smallpox would have gone through. Elizabeth loved her friend Lady Mary Sidney, and being a very great queen and of the age and how it was, those monarchs didn't humble themselves very often. You went to see them, not the opposite way round. But Lady Mary Sidney became the exception because she was so badly disfigured that she would never again be allowed to allow herself to be seen in public. And for a monarch to go privately and quietly to a subject was a very rare thing, but that's what Elizabeth did. There was a great friendship and love and bond between them because the loyalty that Mary showed through nursing Elizabeth, and obviously on Elizabeth's side there would have been a tremendous amount of guilt that her friend and lady in waiting that had caught the disease. So Elizabeth made sure Lady Mary was cared for the rest of her life. Elizabeth was treated by Dr. Burcott with barley water and poppy seeds wrapped in red sheets to reflect the pox, and put before the fire to try and sweat the fever out. Miraculously, she did recover. Dr. Burcott wasn't known for his bedside manner, even to a queen, and when Elizabeth looked at her skin and saw the pox marks on it, she groaned in distress, and Dr. Burcott went, "Pah, better to have the pox on the skin than in the heart and kill the whole body." So yeah, he wasn't best known for his bedside manner, and he actually had to be forced back into the room at the point of a dagger, because when he first went to visit the Queen, when she was convinced she had a cold and he said it was the pox and she sent him away, called him a fool, when they discovered it was the pox, he refused to go back, and it's said that Lord Robert Dudley made him go back at the point of a sword, but he treated the Queen and she recovered. It does say that she wasn't too badly disfigured, but she was disfigured, and that is what gave us the Queen that she became, unchanging and changeless. The scars on her face, which she was, and her hands, she was very conscious of. Her makeup routine was something that anyone would just not want nowadays because it took a long time. She would have the paints and paste put on her face every day to hide the scars. Unfortunately, a lot of these makeups of the time had things like arsenic and white lead in there, which would have only made the problems worse. As the Queen got older, she lost all her hair, so probably due to the arsenic and the lead and stuff like that, so she wore red wigs. But this is what Elizabeth looked like for a lot of her reign. She didn't like having portraits painted of herself, and when they were painted, she would make damn sure that she examined them first, because this was a woman that did not want to be seen to age. So she made sure that her image pretty much stayed the same throughout her reign. It's only towards the end of her reign, as we will see in our last part of the documentary, when you've got the time and death portrait, and that was only released after she died, and you get a little gist of what she actually looked like as she got older. But this is one of the approved images, approved by the Queen herself, and pretty much as her public image and face remained to the public. But if you went to the court and saw the Queen, you wouldn't dare say so because it was treason, but you've got a great shock, particularly as she was very fond of sweets, under the mistaken belief that they would sweeten her breath, which they didn't. They rotted her teeth. And the court ladies at the time blackened their teeth to make them look like the Queen, and it's a fashion thing, and it's crazy to us to think. I mean, even the dresses and clothes from those days to us just look ridiculous. One court whip remarked that the ladies of the court looked like trussed chickens sat upon bells. But Elizabeth recovered from the smallpox, and recovered well enough to carry on with her life. And this is an image kind of from her time, and this is her giving thanks to God for her recovery. She was a very religious and pious woman, as most people were in those days, and she was the head of the Church of England, or Supreme Governor as she was known. So she had to be seen to be the face of that new Church of England, which was a fairly new thing. It had only come about in the reign of her father. Then through the reign of her brother had been strengthened, then overturned under the reign of her sister, and then come back to really as the religion of the public state religion in her time. So religion played a great part of people's lives, deaths and everything in those days. And that's Queen Elizabeth's first little real jaunt with very, very severe danger. I mean, it nearly cost her life. And the Privy Council, once again, were all dead shit scared that she was going to die without an heir. And they didn't know who they'd end up with. So once she recovered, they once again started the jostling and pestering of her to marry. Which sometimes she'd go along with it. She'd even have her so-called suitors brought over or correspondence with them, and would play the game just to edge along to get her subsidy granted to her and to shut them up. She was a player, Queen Elizabeth I, and she knew how to really play the game well. So that's her first time, great turmoil. And now on to the second. Queen Elizabeth I was fond of bestowing nicknames on her greatest favourites, and here we are seeing the greatest favourite, Robert Dudley. And he was her eyes. That was the nickname she gave him. When he paid her off, and it was like a relationship in a way, she could be quite cutting and make some nasty remarks, and one of those once was that Sir Robert is like my little dog, for when he is near, everyone else knows that I myself am near, which was quite a dig really, but yeah. William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, who basically played the role of, although we didn't have a Prime Minister then, that was basically his role. Her nickname for him was her spirit. This man here, who we've not seen in the documentaries before, this is Sir Francis Walsingham. Her nickname for him was her lids, as in the eyelids. Born in 1532 and died in 1590. He was the principal secretary to Queen Elizabeth I from December the 20th, 1573 until his death, and is popularly remembered as her spymaster. And really it was him and his network of spies that kept her alive. They were also the men that badgered her about getting married. Being a queen, an absolute monarch, and someone who could not control their temper, she didn't control her temper. She wasn't above boxing Cecil's ears, throwing things at poor Sir Francis here. Sir Robert, she generally cut with her tongue rather than objects or her hands. One of her maids-in-waiting once who'd peed her off really badly, done something wrong. She lashed out at the girl and broke her finger. Afterwards she felt terrible and apologised, but that doesn't change things, does it, sometimes? And back on to the theme of spymaster and spies and eyes and spirit. That on the left you see Lord Burleigh, her spirit. In the centre, of course, the Queen, and on the right you see Walsingham, her lids. And as these men really did keep her alive with the spy network and everything like that, which leads us on to our next part of the video. And here we see one of her greatest enemies and greatest threats, Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Queen of Scots is a story for another time. If any of you want a documentary on her, let me know. Pretty effed up reign. If you think Elizabeth's and her family was bad, Mary Queen of Scots was certainly no better. Had her husband assassinated, had to flee Scotland, and that's where we pick up on Mary Queen of Scots, and where she comes into our story with Elizabeth. On the 16th of May 1568, a small fishing boat carrying Mary Queen of Scots set sail from Scotland for English shores. After a month of turmoil and conflict in Scotland, she had decided to entrust her fate to her cousin Elizabeth. Don't forget, they were cousins through Elizabeth's father and Elizabeth's father's sister Margaret. They were cousins. Henry VIII's sister Margaret was Queen Elizabeth's aunt. That's where the cousin link comes in. 2 days later, Mary was escorted to Carlisle Castle, and so began almost 19 years as a prisoner in England. Elizabeth wanted proof that Mary was innocent of Darnley's murder. Darnley was Mary's husband, an Englishman who Elizabeth did not want Mary to marry. Mary defied Elizabeth, married him, and it turned out Darnley was an absolute piece of work and made Mary's life a living hell, so she had him killed. Lord Bothwell, and that's another story, as I say. But yeah, Elizabeth wanted proof of Mary was innocent of Darnley's murder before agreeing to a meeting. A conference held at York found to find such proof, and in February 1569, Mary was taken to Tutbury Castle in Staffordshire, a residence of the Earl of Shrewsbury, who became her jailer for almost the next 15 years. There was a great deal of rivalry between Mary and Elizabeth, mostly over the throne, because Mary believed, and Mary's supporters believed, that she had a better right to it than Elizabeth, who many called the bastard child of Anne Boleyn and the music master Mark Smeaton. So there was that rivalry. And on a more personal level, for Elizabeth, who was a very vain woman, a very, very vain woman, there was the aspect of, was Mary prettier than her? One of the Scottish ambassadors, poor man, was drilled and questioned to this several times before Mary's imprisonment. But yeah, the rivalry was pretty nasty, and it would become a lot more nastier, as we'll learn in another part of our documentary later on in the reign. The whole Queen Mary and Elizabeth situation basically sparked off the Privy Council wanting Elizabeth to marry again, and this became a real stalemate between the Queen's Privy Council, Parliament, and the Queen. Don't forget, as we've discussed, the Queen could only rule really with her subsidy granted by the government, and if she didn't do as they wanted, they could not grant the subsidy, quibble over it, or make sure it was a damn sight less than it was. But Queen Elizabeth here, fond of bestowing nicknames, was granted nicknames herself, became known as the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, and Good Queen Bess. She was a clever woman, and a bloody good statesman as well. She knew that all she needed to do was to court the love of her people, which those who were loyal to her and did love her really did so ardently. And the legend of Gloriana built up around her and the Virgin Queen, that she had devoted herself to her people rather than to her husband and children, because she quite and often always said that she was married to the Kingdom of England and that she had children and they were the people of her kingdom. She knew how to butter people up, her people and her parliament. She was known for her great speeches, the Armada speech being the greatest, but some of her parliamentary speeches are very, very great. She knew how to get her subsidy in the end, sometimes with tears, sometimes with an illness, but mostly with her speeches. One of her speeches, which earned her the lifelong love of her people, as she sat in the throne, and this is the illustration from it, before her parliament, she said, "My lords, though many greater princes may come to this seat after me, you will never have a more loving one. So that's a little bit of the statesmanship of Queen Elizabeth I. And now on to the next part of our video, which is a little of the public image of the Queen back then and how it had to be. We're used to seeing our monarchs on television, YouTube, the internet, newspapers, all over the place. None of that existed back then. If you wanted to see an image of your monarch, you would have to look at a coin, which would give you a very rugged, rudimentary image of a monarch. You would have to rely on one of the portraits, and as we've already discussed, they weren't that accurate to life with Queen Elizabeth I, because she kept a strict regulation on what they would look like. So the public face or image of the Queen or King, a monarch of those days, was the royal progress. A progress basically was where the Queen would go about her kingdom, being seen to be seen and seeing others, meeting with her people. And she was a people person. She wouldn't stoop to she wouldn't mind basically talking to the lowliest beggar to the greatest in the land, and she was known for that, and that made her very popular. But yeah, they would go throughout the land and to be seen. There were several reasons for the progress. The main one is what we've just discussed. Another reason was sanitation in those days. Don't forget, they didn't have flushing toilets and running water as we know it. The court, which was a very big place and a very busy place, after so many weeks or months of being there, would become so disgusting that they would have to move on to another place, one of the royal palaces, or to stay with people, guests, while on your progress. And that was done so the palaces could be cleaned for the next time that people were there. The progress was great for the people to see, but it wasn't always great for those that received the progress, because when you received the Queen, you footed the entire bill for her entourage, putting them up, feeding them and everything, and it bankrupted some people. But the people loved to see their Queen, and as you can see her here being carried on a litter. Sprung carriages and such like didn't exist back then, so you would be conveyed on a litter or on horseback, which is what we're seeing here in this image. Wherever the Queen went, the town would be cleaned and sweetened and tarted up, very much like what happens when a royal visits one of our towns today. But the progress all go into court, and you wouldn't always be able to get in there, especially if you were a poor person. To get inside court, you had to be well dressed and look well dressed and well spoken. So the main way to see your monarch in those days was to wait for a progress. She had a lot of progresses throughout her reign. She reigned a long time. She was a great horsewoman. As you can see by the image here, she rides side saddle. No lady would have ever ridden akimbo in those days. It just wasn't done. But the people loved to see their Queen. Elizabeth was a popular monarch in many regards and with many people, but she was unpopular with a lot of other people, and the progress gave her real stress to her lords and her spy masters and everyone that had to keep her safe, her guards. There was people that wanted this woman dead and replaced with a Catholic. So you can imagine the levels of stress of keeping her alive, getting her from place to place, making sure that she wasn't poisoned, checking everything that she was given, because the monarchs in those days, as today, were given a lot of gifts. A gift was given and it turned out to be a poisoned dress, which thank goodness the Queen never put on. Other things you could do, you could send a pair of poisoned gloves, you could present a flower for the Queen to sniff that could be poisoned, you could poison her food, anything like that, and that all had to be thought of and dealt with. So it was a very great deal of trouble, basically, the progress. The Queen enjoyed it, of course, and those who were around her who didn't have to do all the donkey work of it or foot the bill, they enjoyed it too. But yeah, that's a little bit of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, and I hope you're all enjoying the documentary. Please join me again soon for part 3.